Professor Alfred-Maurice Zayas is the one that gives now his presentation, and he has a really lively biography over many pages that I found on the internet. Born in Cuba and then grown in Chicago, studying in Germany, living in Geneva, having done lots of things in the law offices and as professor on different universities in Vancouver and other universities, and then you joined the United Nations in different capacities. And it is a special estimation that the Human Rights Council gave you the task as independent expert for democratic and ethical international order. So I think you fit 100% in our project, and you have the floor to give us a few insights, how you see the things, how is this discussed, what are our chances to promote, and whatever you tell us, you're welcome to have the floor and present your case.
Thank you very much. We'll have to push a button?
Just between.
Thank you, Joe Lyman, and also thank you, Antonio, for getting it going this afternoon. Usually I like to talk freely, but after I make a statement like I'm doing now, I'm saying, oh gosh, I forgot this, forgot that, I forgot that. So in order that at least you get a certain amount of the substance of what I want to say, I have a prepared statement. You can also pick it up at the table outside. I also have copies of my reports to the General Assembly and to the Human Rights Council. They're different, huh? They're not the same report. One report builds on the other one. So with your indulgence, I'm actually going to read the statement. And then I'll take on as many questions as you want to throw at me. And I suppose in the interactive dialogue, probably we can really nail in some of the points. But I'm a great optimist, and as I said, I'm absolutely thrilled about the creation of this mandate. As you said, it was created in September of 2011. It was actually created for a friend of mine, Professor Jean Sigler. And Jean Sigler was supposed to get. On the other hand, there was a rather below-the-belt campaign against him. And so he was discarded, and then he was supposed to go to Milun Kothari, a great Indian activist. Actually, he's an architect. He was the rapporteur on housing. And then on the last day, a tunnel breaks out. And suddenly it fell on my lap. I was totally taken aback. As a matter of fact, at the very moment when the decision was taken by Laura Dupuy to give me the mandate, I was giving a live interview to RT, for all peoples, on Iran and the nuclear program. You can imagine, I was so sure I was not going to get this mandate. On the other hand, once the Council in its wisdom gave it to me, unless I violate Resolution 5/2, the Code of Conduct, they won't get rid of it for the next 6 years. For rather 5 years. I've already had it for a year. So I will read this out so that at least you get a certain amount of substance, and then we can move on. Again, you're going to make a presentation, and then there will be questions afterwards, no doubt. So if you read Resolution 18/6 of the Human Rights Council, 29 September 2011. You will see that it is what is called an omnibus resolution. It is everything. It's aiming at the convergence of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights into a coherent synthesis capable of advancing what is called a just international order. Now, I assume my functions in May 2012. So not in September 2011 when the mandate was created, but only in May 2012. Presented my first report to the Human Rights Council in September 2012, my second report in September 2013. Presented a different report to the General Assembly in November 2012, and will be presenting, God willing and permitting, a new report to the General Assembly on 28 October next. As I said, some copies of the reports in English, French, and Spanish are at the entrance. In its preamble, Resolution 18/6 affirms that democracy, development, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms are interdependent and mutually reinforcing, that democracy is based on the freely expressed will of the people to determine their own political, economic, social, and cultural systems and their full participation in all aspects of their lives. It further emphasizes that democracy is not a political concept, but that it also has economic and social dimensions. Operative paragraph 6 stipulates, and that's what my mandate really goes together with goals of the UNPA. Operative paragraph 6 stipulates that a democratic and equitable international order requires inter alia the realization of international solidarity as a right of peoples and individuals, the promotion and consolidation of transparent, democratic, just, and accountable international institutions in all areas of cooperation, in particular through the implementation of the principle of full and equal participation in their respective decision-making mechanisms, and the right to equitable participation of all without any discrimination in domestic and global decision-making. It thus becomes apparent that the mandate has not only an international but also a national vocation, both of which I have endeavored to take into account in my reports. Critics, and there are plenty of them, critics consider the mandate overbroad and utopian. It is my ambition to persuade the doubters that there is, in fact, added value in the mandate. And accordingly, I formulate concrete and pragmatic recommendations. There are 35 recommendations in my report to the Council and 15 in my report to the General Assembly. So these are pragmatic recommendations which I address to states, to national human rights institutions, to the Council itself, and to civil society. Among my recommendations is the elaboration of a study how the establishment of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly or World Parliamentary Assembly can significantly advance the goal of realizing an international order that is more democratic and more equitable. That is in my report to the Council, recommendation 57d. In my forthcoming report to the General Assembly, I recommended paragraph 69o to convene a conference to discuss the creation of such a body as a World Parliamentary Assembly. I believe actually that it would be premature to try to throw this at the General Assembly too early before you're sure of having the votes that you need. I mean, I'm sure you can seduce any number of states, and any number of states would be happy to table a resolution on a World or United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. But if you did it today, people don't know enough about it, and unless there's been a world conference that has talked about it, where the matters have been discussed back and forth, probably it wouldn't fly. On the other hand, if you do now, as I said, I want to have a study done by the Human Rights Council. What the Council will probably do is give it on to its advisory committee. because the council doesn't really carry out too many studies. They have an advisory committee. The advisory committee can then be mandated to do a study on this. And the General Assembly, on the other hand, could convene a conference or a workshop or anything to discuss it further, probably on the basis of whatever the advisory committee has done. So, I am indebted to many people. I'm indebted particularly to Professor Joseph Schwarzberg for his pertinent publications, particularly his forthcoming book, Transforming the United Nations System, which is being published by the United Nations University now in November. Now, I had the privilege of reading the manuscript, and with Joe's approval, I also used it extensively. I have a whole section here, paragraphs 23, 24, 25, on the World Parliamentary Assembly, and also on the reform of the United Nations system, reform, which is General Assembly reform of the Security Council, and I draw substantially from this extremely valuable book, and I hope that it will be out very soon, the sooner the better. As a matter of fact, if I get a copy, I will lift it at the General Assembly in a couple of weeks' time, and I will show them. In any event, I'm also indebted to Andreas Bommel, who kindly followed my invitation to a day-long expert consultation, which we held in Geneva on 16th of May this year, which significantly helped me to formulate my own ideas about the modalities of establishing such a World Parliamentary Assembly. Seen from the perspective of international democracy, I told you that the mandate covers both international and domestic. It's obvious that the Security Council is undemocratic. It's obvious. Not only because of its limited composition, but also because of the privileges that only 5 permanent members of the Council enjoy. Other players that exercise enormous power on all of us are similarly undemocratic in their modus operandi, notably the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. It would be desirable to bring the financial institutions under the supervision of the United Nations pursuant to Articles 57 and 63 of the UN Charter. These bodies should also report, why not? Should also report to the Human Rights Council. They have an enormous human rights impact. Why shouldn't they report, as states do, before the Human Rights Council in the Universal Periodic Review process? Transnational corporations also exercise enormous influence without being subjected to the rules of transparency and accountability. At present, the most representative body within the United Nations is, of course, the General Assembly. But only ambassadors sit in the Assembly, representing governments, and not always the people of the respective countries. Moreover, because the Assembly lacks the power of implementation, its decisions are frequently flouted, and the will of the international community is ignored. Reform of the United Nations must revitalize the General Assembly and give it enhanced powers, as I have proposed in my reports, and particularly in the press release that I issued for International Day of Peace on the 21st September last. If you go on the website of the United Nations, you will find it. As far as domestic democracy, all here present know that democracy means government by the people. While we agree that consultation and participation are essential to every democracy, this is seldom achieved in practice. In Switzerland, where I live, the model of direct democracy, characterized by the people's right to initiative, referenda, recall, and impeachment has proven itself. But democracy cannot mean just majority rule. Democracy must be understood within the framework of a constitution and the rule of law, which must protect also the rights and the interests of dissenters and minorities. By comparison, the prevalent system of representative democracy, I'm an American citizen, and that's what we have in the United States, representative democracy. Of course, my congresswoman doesn't care about the many emails that I send her, nor does my senator. In any event, the prevalent system of representative democracy frequently suffers from what some other observers have already called a disconnect between power and the people. A parliament only has legitimacy when parliamentarians genuinely represent their constituencies and are not legibus solutus, or free to do anything they choose, to cater to special interests, such as the military-industrial complex and the financial bankers, instead of being true to their forgotten campaign promises and doing what the electorate wants them to do. The Danish Institute for Human Rights, a national human rights institution based in Copenhagen, is currently conducting a study on the right of public participation. This is one of the publications revisiting the role of civil society in the promotion of human rights. It's a very worthwhile study. In any event, I attended the first workshop last September, a few weeks ago, and argued that the right of public participation is not just a vague promise, but actually has a solid legal basis in universal, in regional, and in national legislation, as well as in case law. The actual practice of public participation, however, is much less developed. Participation is a hallmark of democratic governance, entailing a measure of timely consultation so as to legitimize the exercise of governmental power. Indeed, since democratic governments must by definition operate with the consent of the governed, it is a responsibility of governments to adopt the necessary measures so as to enable free, prior, and informed consent. All democratic governments have a responsibility to proactively inform. I always say that's a duty of the state to proactively inform the population in a timely fashion, in a transparent fashion, about matters relevant to domestic governance and foreign policy. Not only domestic governance, because I would like to have more consultation of Washington with the American citizens. I mean, do you want to engage in this particular adventure, to intervene here or intervene there? Should we be spending our money for this or for that? Matters of foreign policy are also matters where the population has a right to know and a right to be heard. In any event, I think that through opinion polling and other means, it would be possible to give more space to civil society and to hear the priorities that the people actually want. In order to effectively exercise the right of public participation, access to reliable, truthful, and pluralistic information must be ensured. You mentioned that I grew up in Chicago. Yes, I remember when I graduated high school 50 years ago, there were about 30 newspapers in Chicago. And the difference, whether you read the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times, it's enormous. When I was professor at DePaul University for a year, 1993-94, already in those 30 years, the homologation, or what the Germans might call Gleichschaltung, of the press was such that there was very little difference whether I read the one newspaper or the other, and also the number of newspapers had significantly decreased. And today, I think whether you hear CNN or the crazies at Fox, the Washington Times, you're getting pretty much the same type of manipulated news. Now, I think it's important to reflect on possible options and alternative solutions. This necessitates an enabling environment where freedom of opinion, expression, media, peaceful assembly, and association are not only possible in principle on the books, you know, you have a right on the Bill of Rights, but how are they being exercised in practice? That's what is interesting. It bears repeating. According to the ethos of the social contract, democratic governance means rule by the consent of the ruled, and this necessarily entails participation. In totalitarian and authoritarian forms of government, of course, the right to participation is systematically denied. It doesn't exist. But even in liberal democracies, whose constitutions recognize the basic civil and political rights, participation is often dysfunctional. And there are varying degrees of disconnect between the will and the needs of the people and the governmental policies that affect them. The right of participation, however, is not a political panacea, a guarantee of social justice, or a recipe for peace. While majority rule is an expression of democracy, it may entail a form of populism that disregards the rights of women, the rights of indigenous, minorities, migrants, disabled persons, vulnerable groups, and others, and therefore results in inequities. Accordingly, the right of participation must be exercised prudently within the context of the rule of law and include human rights safeguards so that public participation and majority rule do not cause harm to individuals and groups, do not disenfranchise the less fortunate, and do not legitimize, for instance, torture and capital punishment, even if a majority of the population could be manipulated into demanding and or voting for such inhuman and dehumanizing measures. A corollary to this right of public participation must be the state's duty, as I said before, its duty to transparency and proactive disclosure of information. Education in human rights and civil duties should enable the public to understand the political process as a daily commitment to values, such as respect for the opinions of others, tolerance, compassion, and solidarity. Participation is a process that encompasses the elaboration and adjustment of rules and regulations, the pre-electoral and the post-electoral interaction of the authorities and the public. It entails a responsibility of the public to remain alert and to demand accountability from government officials, bearing in mind that in democracies the holders of power have obligations to society and exercise power only as trustees. Among the obstacles to the exercise of the right of participation are, of course, the cost of conducting consultations. The same as United Nations Parliamentary Assembly is going to cost some money. But I mean, the money is there. I mean, just take 10% of the military budget away, there's plenty of money for everything. In any event, the cost of consultations with stakeholders, opinion polling, referenda, etc. Other more generic obstacles include apathy, disillusionment with the political process, and the general feeling that the structures of government have become so rigid and are not subject to meaningful reform. Most will agree that participation cannot be limited to the ballot box, and that while regular free elections are necessary to every democracy, such elections must provide real alternatives and not just a continuation of the status quo. Not without reason, some observers like Emma Goldman, I hope that somebody knows Emma Goldman, have remarked, if voting made any difference, they'd make it illegal. The same idea is attributed to the German thinker Kurt Tucholsky. Wenn Wahlen etwas ändern würden, Dann wären sie verboten. If elections could change anything, that would be forbidden. Without endorsing a cynical perspective on the political process, it must be noted that the elites of most countries have worked hard to ensure economic and political stability by limiting the possibilities of structural change to the machinery of government. Moreover, in some democracies, special interest groups and lobbies have denatured democratic decision-making by exercising undue influence on the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. This is why some observers have noted that in some countries, those who have been elected do not govern, and those who do govern have not been elected. Vested interests, notably corporate interests, must not be allowed to trump the wills of the majority of the population. It should be emphasized that reform through public participation does not pose a threat to stability. On the contrary, reform of institutions is a condition of stability. Thus, governing elites need not fear the exercise of the right to participation, because such exercise enables gradual adjustment and gives the population a sense of satisfaction through ownership of their own destinies. A population that can meaningfully influence governmental policy through consultation and voting ensures continuity in harmony. A condition for the proper functioning of public participation is a governmental commitment to transparency, in particular in fiscal and budget matters. Government secrecy under the pretext of national security or any other pretext undermines the public trust. This is why whistleblowers serve an important human rights function in uncovering unconstitutional behavior and even crimes by government officials. Intimidation of human rights defenders, their arrest and detention, or their defamation as unpatriotic or even treasonous contravenes the people's right to know. A further condition to effective participation is a pluralistic media that respects the people's right to know and their right to truth. Manipulation of public opinion, whether by governmental authorities or by the private sector media, sabotages the democratic process. Yet another obstacle is the growing problem of political correctness, which ultimately leads to self-censorship, stagnation, and the failure to express one's true needs and priorities. Moreover, when a person cannot express his or her views, not only is his or her right to freedom of expression violated, but also, look at it from the other aspect, also the right of the others, the right of society to know, their right to hear the views and the perspectives that are being suppressed. Civil society is entitled to more space, and it must vindicate its right to be heard. One promising avenue of giving such space to the citizens of the planet is precisely the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly or United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which could start initially as a consultative body and gradually develop into a legislative assembly. This is an ambitious plan, but one that, with patience and determination, is implementable, taking the European Parliament as a model. If the United Nations General Assembly is to be revitalized, as I have asked in my report, if it's going to be strengthened, it also needs to be made more democratic and more representative. Complementing it with a parliamentary body could be a key to achieving this. Over the next 5 years, I hope that my mandate will give me ample opportunities to discuss the matter with stakeholders like yourselves, to learn from you how best to advance on the project. I thank you for your attention. That is just what I wrote down rather quickly the other night before coming, because I thought that at least those points I wanted to get out. Now they're out in the public. And there'll be plenty of opportunity, I hope, for you to ask questions, and then at least I will not subject you to actually reading a text. Thank you.
Zayas, thank you so much for that powerful message you gave us, the concept of democracy internally in states, but as well globally between states and on the human base of this planet Earth. This was excellent. I think there's a lot of elements in it, and I'm happy that two members of our campaign, George Schwarzberg, of course, has done that for years, and Andreas Bummel had been nourishing your enthusiasm for that idea of a World Parliament and UN Parliamentary Assembly. Thanks a lot. And I think that was extremely highlight of our 2 days meeting here in Brussels. And we will have questions and work on it later on.